Congresswoman, I also want to ask you kind of this idea of self-censorship. That's been a topic a lot lately, and there's I think this generalized fear out there of, and for a lot of people in a lot of different venues, that, well, I can't really speak my mind, and I'm worried about what will happen if I do. Can you comment on kind of your insights on that phenomenon? Yeah,
I would be happy to. Right before we are recording this podcast, I was at the University of Utah talking to college students, and these are political science majors for the most part. These are people who are willing to show up at a political event at a university. And we asked them some poll questions, 2 sets of questions I thought were interesting. One was, how concerned are you about violence at political events? And the number of people who said they were concerned about it was higher than the number of people who said they were going to change their behavior and be less likely to go to a political event. Then later we asked them, how many of you are concerned that expressing a political view could have a negative impact on your future career or your educational prospects? And again, the number who said that they were concerned about that was higher than the number who said they self-censor and don't speak out. So I think even people who are saying they're concerned know that it's an anxiety as much as it is a real problem. And I talked to some students afterwards who said the same thing. They said, I'm scared of speaking out, but now that you talked about it, I've never actually had any harm come to me from saying my political views. And I do think, in the context of what we've been talking about, there is a difference between expressing your political views in a constructive way and saying, this is who I am and what I believe and where I'm coming from, as opposed to, I'm right and you're evil. I do think that I'm right and you're evil kind of argument has negative impacts on people's careers and their educational prospect. But learning to have constructive dialogue is actually, I think we all know it's healthy, and most people are not going to be punished at work for having a sincere conversation where they're respectful. But the fear is out there because of the way we talk about politics, I think especially online when it's disembodied, where somebody says something and then a lot of other people pile on, and so they're like, I'm going to self-censor and not talk about the hard topics because there may be ramifications. When in the real world, having the hard conversations is actually a more positive outcome than not having them.
You know what? One anecdote that comes to mind in years past, and a couple different job opportunities I've had. Very early on, I worked for a TV news station, and part of the job for periods of the day was answering the phone if it rang, and on occasion someone would call in to just complain about something about the news show we were doing. Yeah. And in that time, my job was not to debate with them. It was just to sort of take their concerns and understand it and, pass it on to the right folks. And then also in other capacities, what I've worked for elected officials, fielding calls in the same kind of way that people call in to complain about your boss, whatever elected official you're working for at the time. And what I noticed in both of those experiences was, I think partly just the structure of that role. Again, I wasn't supposed to debate with them. I was just supposed to hear their concerns, answer questions if I could, and then pass it on. The vast majority of the time, if I just gave them time to talk, and if they truly felt heard, if they felt listened to, and this is particularly true when I was working for elected officials, that even if my response was something that they didn't necessarily like as far as an outcome of whatever their issue was, giving them the space to feel listened to and feel heard, I would say 80% of the time, it absolutely turned down the temperature. And at the end of the call, they were saying, Nick, I get that you guys can't do this or you're not with me on this, but I still appreciate your time.
Yeah.
That's a phenomenon that I think it gets what you're saying, that real human connection makes a difference.
Yeah, no, we want to be recognized as being valid. I mean, it's just a basic human need. So when you call, even if you call a store with a question about their product, if you're pressing 1 and then pressing 2 and you get kind of frustrated, but if someone could say to you, I'm sorry, the product's not working, we designed these to work, let me see what I can do to help you, then you feel validated, and all of a sudden you feel like you're connecting with a person. I told this story at the University of Utah. I'm going to tell it again here. I'll do it quickly. But the day Charlie Kirk got shot, and I was in Washington, D.C., and we went to the floor to vote very soon after that news broke. And so everybody was still very raw. There was good information coming out, bad information coming out, and nobody quite knew what was true yet. And then suddenly, here we all were on the House floor. And as someone from Utah, I was getting a lot of questions that I didn't know the answers to. And as I stepped onto the House floor, one of my colleagues had his baby there that day, and he handed me a baby. And that was it. He didn't make everything okay. He didn't tell me it was going to be all right, but he handed me a baby, and the baby was in a snuggly mood and just settled down on my chest, and I could feel my anxiety levels coming down, and I could feel, my system sort of regulating. And I do think that's indicative of, as humans, we need contact with other humans. When it feels like everything's coming at us, then our, cortisol levels and our adrenaline levels and whatever, I'm not a doctor, but we're on high alert. But when we have connection with people, that helps bring us back down to a more reasonable state. And so I think what you're saying is accurate. If you're calling in to a politician's office to complain, you want to be treated like a human being. You want that human connection. You want someone to see you as a valid person with a valid complaint, even if they're never going to agree with you. If someone's calling my office and asking me to back a policy that I philosophically disagree with, I'm not going to be able to say, yeah, I'll vote the way you want me to. But they still want me to recognize that they have reasons for calling in. And if I can recognize that, it does help us have an actual conversation instead of I'm going to go online and type about my mic drop moment. And that's different.
Yeah, it's something to strive for sure. And Congresswoman, in the few minutes that we have left, do you mind if I kind of throw some just rapid fire? There's just a few quick policy issues.
Yeah.
Love to get your take on for our audience. And then if any of what we're talking about factors into the way you're advancing these causes, of course, feel free to go in that direction.
Happy to.
But I want to ask you about energy, because in recent coverage, you've actually mentioned that removing federal barriers to energy is an incredibly important issue for the United States.
It is.
And there's a lot of growth of energy needs. There's a lot of conversations around AI and the data centers that will draw energy and those kinds of things. So what changes do you envision? And I think you've mentioned permitting reforms before, but what's the big thing we need to be focused on in terms of energy policy reform, and what are you trying to move in that direction?
So I do think it's permitting reform, and I introduced the FREE Act, which would be a really big shift in how we do permitting without sacrificing any quality of how we do permitting, but making it faster, more efficient, and it wouldn't cost as much. And this is a good example of the kind of thing we've been talking about. Traditionally, Democrats have liked more bureaucracy because they feel like it keeps us safe and it keeps, people from harming each other. Republicans tend to like less bureaucracy because we feel like bureaucracy gets in the way, keeps us from doing things, and it's just too much government. Through conversations with my Democrat colleagues about what it is they're concerned about, we've found some ways to come together. I'm part of the Build America Caucus, which is focused on permitting reform. It's bipartisan because Democrats have things they care about that they want to get done. Republicans have things we care about and want to get done. And there's some overlap. But even in the areas where our priorities don't overlap, the bureaucracy slowing things down is an overlap we can agree on. And if we solve that problem, it makes it better for Democrat projects and Republican projects, even if we don't want the same projects.
And the FREE Act is the full responsibility and expedited enforcement act. If that's successful, just kind of give us the quick version of what will that fix? What do you hope that it will do?
So it would be a permit by rule system where instead of applying for a permit from an agency and then waiting on an individual to make a decision and having ambiguous timelines, if there are timelines at all, and sort of a construct where it's not clear who gets to make the call or when they know they're safe saying yes. A permit by rule system says these are the standards we have, and when you meet these standards, we'll issue a permit. And if you don't meet these standards, we'll tell you what doesn't meet the standards. If you can fix it, fix it. And that would shorten the timeline a lot. So especially with infrastructure projects, a lot of the cost of the projects is the permitting process and then the time that gets eaten up with permitting, because projects get more expensive over time with inflation and other factors. So when we can do projects more quickly, they cost less, and we're not wasting all of the money on the process itself. We could put more dollars into the actual projects.
Last question, Congresswoman. The rapid growth of AI. I mean, it's we actually did kind of a mini series on the show about AI in different policy scenarios.
Yeah.
And it's increasingly just one of those topics that gets discussed every single day. Are there things that you think either Congress or even the state of Utah should be considering to ensure that we stay competitive? In other words, like a lot of people I've heard talking about this as sort of the Cold War arms race of our generation. Yeah. What do we do as a state and nation to stay competitive and to lead in AI?
So we've got to allow AI to be developed. And this was a misstep that Congress started to make actually this year. In the first version of the One Big Beautiful Bill, there was a prohibition in there on states regulating AI. And the reason it was in there is because some of my colleagues were worried about states stifling AI innovation for the reasons you just talked about, the new Cold War kind of aspect. But the state of Utah came to us and said, hey, we have some AI regulations that actually help and make it easier to innovate without abusing anybody. And so we pulled that language out of the last version of the One Big Beautiful Bill because of productive conversations we had with the state. And again, not to keep harping on the same topic, but it's one of those times where we were doing something that the state didn't like. The state felt like they had a better idea. Having us all get together and talk about it, we didn't know at the beginning if we were going to be able to get to common ground, but we got to a much better place because instead of them tweeting at us and us tweeting at them, we talked about it and found a way to fix it.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.